increasingly aggressive when it comes to any democratic attempts in the region around it and in the places that it regards to be its territory. But at the same time, there is a challenge of rivalry for the transatlantic community. And with this event, we are aiming for providing our audience with a valuable insight into the geopolitical context and environment of Taiwan's international relations, on the one hand, Chinese-Taiwanese relations, and the relationship between the United States and China, the relationship between United States and Taiwan, and how it can change Taiwan's international relations, on the one hand, Chinese-Taiwanese relations. Okay. How the U.S.-Chinese relationship is going to change as a result of the new presidential election. Also, there is on the plate of the European Union a new trade agreement with China that received many criticisms. So it becomes an important player in the game as well. And so this, and also there is an increasingly spectacular role of China within Central Eastern Europe that has become even more visible in the light of the pandemic and the mask and vaccine diplomacy. So without further ado, let me introduce the speakers. I'm Peter Krakow, Director of Political Capital Institute and a Senior Fellow of the Center for European Policy Analysis in DC. So we have 4 very good speakers with us today. Ivana Karaskova, who is the China Research Fellow at the AMO Research Center of the Czech Republic, and the founder and leader of the MapInfluenCE project. If you ever read anything about China and Central Eastern Europe, you must have bumped into the analysis of the MapInfluenCE project. Yuyan Kuo, the Executive Director of the Institute for National Policy Research of Taiwan, and also the co-organizer of the event. Andrew Small, Senior Transatlantic Fellow at Asia Program of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and at the same time, an Associate Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. So, hi everyone, and also Tamás Matura, the founder of Central and Eastern European Center for Asian Studies, and assistant professor at the Corvinus University of Budapest. So after so many titles, let me jump into the first question. And the first question would be a complicated one that I think needs some explanation for many in the audience as well. So after decades of highly complicated and problematic relations, People's Republic of China sees Taiwan still as a breakaway province, while Taiwan, or as we can say, the Republic of China, struggles to gain international recognition in the shadow of Beijing. Also, I mean, the current happenings around Hong Kong strongly challenge even the idea that was by Taiwan contested from the very beginning of the one nation, two systems concept. So my first question would be to you, Dr. Kuo. How do you see the prospects of the Taiwan-China relationship? Should we expect more tensions or the, let's say, threats that we often hear from Beijing are rather should be regarded as empty bluff? So,
okay. Thank you, Peter, and all other fellows. It's quite an honor to join this webinar with you. To Peter's question, I will just simply put, after Xi Jinping took office in the late 2012, the very nature of close trade has been changing rapidly and at very large degree. I I will, right to Peter's question, I will characterize the closer relation, I mean the relation between China and Taiwan after year 2013 from 4 aspects. And from one very simple language is China's tough stance becomes tougher and soft stance becomes softer. And this tough stance is toward the government of Taiwan, of course, and softer stance is to the people of Taiwan. So the very first character of Xi Jinping's close trade policy or Taiwan policy is a separation of Taiwanese government and the people. So they basically apply very different measures toward the government of Taiwan and the people on the island. And for the people's side, for example, year 2020, I mean last year, Chinese government basically announced 26 and 31 special measures, I mean special treatment to Taiwanese people, allowing them to have citizen treatment in mainland China. So that is an example for softer stance toward the people of Taiwan. But for tougher stance toward the government of Taiwan, we are basically looking at 3 things. Number one, in terms of military and security. So I will play a little bit of my PowerPoint to show you how China has been salami slicing to invade Taiwan's air and sea spaces. And second is, as all of you know, is Taiwan's international space. And number 3 is econ and trade, especially recently, 2 weeks ago, China imposed a ban on Taiwan's pineapple exporting to China. So those are the 3 tougher stance in security, Taiwan's international space, and econ and trade aspects. And number 3 is China's sharp power. Speaking of China's sharp power in Taiwan, we are basically talking about 2 things. China has been illegally channeling money to Taiwan for various purposes I will introduce. And then also, not to mention, China tried to organize these pro-unification or pro-China people here in Taiwan, individuals, groups, or organizations. For the purposes, number 1, to manipulate Taiwan's elections, including local elections and also presidential election or congressional elections. And then second, to wage this misinformation campaign here in Taiwan, to mislead the people of Taiwan about, for example, Taiwanese government's policy toward China or China's policy toward Taiwan. And also as well as the overall international environment, including the pandemic situation this time. So to channel money and to organize pro-China people here in Taiwan to wage this misinformation campaign here in Taiwan. And number 4 is the penetration or infiltration to hollow Taiwan. A recent example, which happened yesterday, 2 companies set up by Chinese government, it's their child company or their grandchild company, setting up at Hsinchu city, Taiwan. That city is famous for semiconductor. So that 2 companies in last year, year 2020, recruited more than 300 technicians, engineers from TSMC and other semiconductor companies here in Taiwan. So the penetration and infiltration of China to Taiwan is not only at the high-tech industry, but also to our government and to our military as well. So to Peter's first question, I will answer this separation of Taiwanese government and people. That's first character. Second is imposing threats on security, on Taiwan's international space, and also Taiwan's econ and trade. And number three is imposing this sharp power to Taiwan, and also the penetration and infiltration to Taiwan. So I will characterize the cross strait from the relation between Taiwan and China from those four characteristics.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian, for the very concise but good overview. One follow-up question. Of course, the election results are indicative in this sense. Still, are there any polls that give us a picture on how successful China's disinformation campaign is in Taiwan? So what, or if there are no polls, what is your impression? How easy it is for China to win hearts and minds in Taiwan?
Okay, I will answer your question from two aspects. Number one, in terms of misinformation campaign influencing Taiwan's election. For the central government election, for example, Congress or the presidential election, misinformation campaign attacking individual candidates have been working pretty good. Yeah, but in terms of impacting the overall result of central elections, it is not. But it has huge impact on local elections. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and second aspect to your question is the term we call digital authoritarianism. China is very good in utilizing technology in imposing its power. So the reason why I'm saying that is, for example, your smartphone. We receive all this information from their content farm, like every day. Yeah. So I don't have problem with that because I'm an intellectual here, but I cannot guarantee that our people will be able to distinguish those information is true or false. That easy. Yeah, so I will answer your questions from these two aspects.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's a problem everywhere. I mean, with this information, that there are problems of the audience in distinguishing between what is true and what is false. Of course, it has quite, let's say, high stake in the case of the Taiwan-China relationship. But thank you very much. I would turn to you, Andrew, now, and. Yes, I would be curious about how do you see the prospects of the relationship between United States and China and United States and Taiwan. So it's an open secret practically that Taiwan welcomed the Trump administration's policy to significantly strengthen US-Taiwan relations. But at the same time, with certain observers arguing that Taipei was concerned about the transition to the Biden administration. Early indications, however, are rather suggesting that the Biden administration plans to double down on Trump's Taiwan's policy. So what is your expectation of the Biden foreign policy in the Southeast Asian region, as Washington and Beijing are heading for an even greater political and economic rivalry? And one connected question is that should anyone think that there is a more dovish era coming in the relationship between the United States and Southeast Asian region, which is generally the case with the democratic administrations, or this time is going to be something different? So Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and very happy to join this discussion today. So let me cover a couple of pieces of this. First, directly to that piece of the question, the kind of points of commonality and difference that we might expect in US policy in the region and in China policy specifically. And then let me touch a little bit maybe on the Taiwan piece of this, not just in a US-Taiwan context, but I think also in this kind of wider democratic coalition context that I think is now increasingly at the heart of US-China policy and the US approach to the region. So to begin with just a couple of points on the sort of the shifts and common threads that I think we'll see from, and are already seeing really from the Biden-Trump transition. So first, I think the points of commonality. There are clearly important strands of the Trump administration's approach that had a lot of bipartisan support and that we know are going to continue, and it's already been made clear that that's so. The concept of the Indo-Pacific is now part of broader US strategy. I think there's a much deeper commitment now in the US government and Congress to just according a higher priority to the wider region as essentially the dominant regional theater for US strategy. I don't think that's going to change at all, and I think that's been made very clear. I think this fundamental reappraisal that we saw of China policy under the Trump administration was understood by a lot of the new team to be absolutely necessary, and the view that competition with China has to treat economics, technology, and ideology to a certain extent as well, as centrally as it does the military balancing question, I think is going to stick. And again, I think we're seeing that already. Some of the most important moves that we saw in the previous administration on export controls, investment restrictions, competing with the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of these things came from Congress anyway, and I think will also persist, even if it's quite clear that the implementation in areas such as supply chain realignment, technology restrictions, both of which have significant implications for Taiwan as well, I think are likely to be underpinned by more serious modeling, consultation with domestically and with other partners too, rather than the kind of slightly unplanned, less coordinated approach that we sometimes saw from the Trump administration. But then we have, I think, the points of critique that were there from the team coming in as well. And I think the central one was really that the Trump administration was often seen as confrontational without doing the competition pieces with China fully effectively. The view is that they failed to mobilize allies behind US strategy, that it didn't address some of the domestic drivers of US competitiveness in a serious way, and that a lot of the efforts were focused sort of excessively on the counter-China dimensions of policy rather than on strengthening US capabilities. And I think a lot of the goals that the administration supposedly pursued, whether it was on structural change to the Chinese economy or democracy in Hong Kong, were often undercut by President Trump's essential indifference to them, particularly on the values questions. The sense is as well that some of the regional institutions in Asia, including in Southeast Asia, and the wider multilateral space wasn't taken seriously enough by the last administration. And then to a certain extent that there wasn't enough space preserved in the relationship with China to pursue some limited areas of cooperation where necessary, and to kind of manage the conflict between the two sides effectively. That there needed to be some sense that you couldn't just do all fronts confrontation without clearer priorities about where that made most sense. I think there's also a bit of a view that there was too much of a sense that the US could change China's behavior rather than figuring out how to live with the kind of the consequences of that not being able to happen. And I think all of these are arguments and a mindset that we are seeing feeding into how the new administration is pursuing its approach. More ally-centered, and there's a lot of emphasis on sort of stitching together allies in Europe and Asia. We have, of course, the Quad meeting this week as well. More democratic values-based than I think President Trump, at least himself, was focused on. More of a kind of revived commitment to some of these neglected institutions. I think we'll see that with a lot of the sort of East Asian summits and wider summitry that takes place. And then a lot more focus on this kind of competition piece with China rather than just the stop China bits, which I think, as we're already seeing domestically on the US side, means more focus on industrial policy, the technology and innovation base, and externally, as we've already seen, a lot of focus on, for instance, the supply chain work, and some of it being the positive sum elements, positive sum sell to other countries too. And I would just kind of mention, because I think this hasn't necessarily been teased out as much. I think on some of the classic trade issues, the Trump administration actually was just using a lot of US levers to pursue some very traditional objectives: market access, reform on the China's part, bilateral purchases, it was a lot of the kind of old trade and economic agenda, just with more willingness to slap tariffs on China to get there. And I think, and again, I think this has a lot of implications for the Taiwan piece of this as well. The Biden administration, I think, has a different premise, that if we're dealing with a China that wants to weaponize dependency, that there's this full steam ahead on the Chinese side towards self-reliance, domestic supply chains, and this kind of heightened securitization of economic strategy that Xi Jinping's pursuing, why should deepening access for US firms be the priority? Why should we continue to pretend that there's going to be a reform agenda in China? And I think that makes for a very different set of priorities. It's a less China-driven economic policy and a lot more focused on kind of US and partner capabilities to compete, third markets, how to defend US economic interests more effectively, less so on the kind of what can you push for US multinationals in the Chinese market. The very last point I'd make is just this kind of wider context for Taiwan now that really goes beyond the US. And I think we'll tee up some of the conversations that we'll have about the European piece of this as well. We have, exactly as you said in your question, seen a lot of continuity already on the US side in this rock solid position to take the kind of standard language that's being used from the Biden administration. But I think we're seeing kind of a wider shift really in the opportunities for Taiwan. And it's not just on the US side. Clearly, some of this is China driven. Wider views on China have shifted. There's clearly a different political consensus emerging. I think on the European side, particularly among parliamentarians and publics, I think this goes a lot further than where the actual parameters of European policy are right now. I think we're also seeing in the US and elsewhere, including again in Europe, because China's moved from this very tight definition of core interests to this incredibly expansive across the board one that even includes COVID origins and things like this. I think it's reduced countries' willingness to dance around some of the issues that China expects them to and that maybe they were willing to in the past, including very much on Taiwan. The Hong Kong and Xi Jinping factor certainly has played into things very seriously as well. I think there's certainly a greater sense that the willingness for risk-taking on China's part is higher, the levels of coercion and repression have increased, and I think there's more concern about signaling to China that there will be consequences if it takes certain actions. That's going to be there on the US side. I think that's actually coming a little bit more to the fore on the European side as well. But I think there's been a lot of positive sum factors for Taiwan as well. I mean, rattling through a couple of them, the TSMC factor, as you might call it, an understanding of the heightened strategic importance of Taiwan in the context of the forms of economic and technology competition that are now taking place. An understanding, I think, this kind of canary in the coal mine factor, as Dr. Eugene Kuo just laid out, an understanding that Taiwan is really now at the cutting edge of what everyone else is going to experience soon, whether that's in the shop power space, disinformation, election manipulation, or the forms of economic coercion, and that we all really need to start taking lessons from that. The COVID factor has been important. I think there's an understanding as a result of what played out with the WHO that there can be real costs involved in Chinese efforts to close down Taiwan's international space, and that there needs to be more of a pushback on that. And finally, I think there's been a sort of democracy factor, a better understanding that the model of democracy that's developed in Taiwan, especially in the digital realm, has lessons well beyond its borders when it comes to kind of the resilience and effectiveness of governing. And I think the pandemic was a really good lesson there for people as well. And so it really does start to create some different opportunities. I think this is true on the US side, but I think this has to be seen through this wider democratic coalition prism as well. There's chances for heightened levels of engagement, including higher seniority levels. I think that's clearly, we'll see that passing across between the Trump and Biden administrations, stronger push on Taiwan's international space that I think is possible, stronger signaling to China about some of the ramifications of its coercive behavior. And finally, I think reevaluating the economic framework for relations with Taiwan. We're seeing that a bit already on supply chains. Hopefully we'll get some resumption of the US talks, trade and investment framework agreement discussions, things like that. But on the European side too, the comprehensive agreement on investment with China clears the way. I mean, for all the faults of it, it does clear the way for more serious space for an EU-Taiwan agreement too. This was always, the China agreement was always the excuse for not pushing that ahead. I think it's going to be difficult. There's still some obstacles there, and there'll still be some political maneuvering to make sure that that happens. But I think there can be a stronger push on the European side too, to build a different international economic framework for Taiwan. So I see a lot of context of opportunities with the Biden administration, with the wider framework of its approach, but in terms of the European democratic coalition context, and some of the developments in understanding of what's been going on in and with Taiwan in the last few years.
Okay, thank you. And I would I would have some follow-up questions, but let it do in the second round. And I would like to encourage, first of all, our participants and in the audience that they can raise questions whenever they would like to in the Q&A block on the surface. So please feel free. And I would like to pick up from here where Andrew ended and turn to Tamás first. And I would raise questions to Tamás and Ivana. You both have overlapping, expertise. You both understand the EU-China and EU-Taiwan relations, but focus on CEE as well. So I would raise questions to you, but feel free to respond to the others as well. So first Tamás, what do you think about what Andrew have just told? Do you think that this strange relationship between the European Union and China, and right now the possibility of the trade agreement also brings opportunities for the EU to make more conditions for a trade agreement and change China's approach and behavior in issues related, for example, to Taiwan. And also, of course, it's hard to talk about the EU as a unified entity and homogeneous entity in that respect, because clearly the European Council, European Commission, European Parliament have different approaches. But what seems to me as a contradiction is, on the one hand, the European Union declares simultaneously China as economic competitor, a systemic rival, but at the same time, of course, a cooperation partner. But it still seems that there is no really such a thing as EU-China policy. And right now, I think still this kind of strategic autonomy concept is on the table. And the fears over how reliable partner the United States is, this is something that amplifies the voices in Western Europe about there is a need for stronger economic cooperation with China. So to make my question crystal clear, what do you expect from this EU-China trade agreement, how it can develop, how it can change the relationship between European Union as a whole and China, and also can it have a beneficial impact on the relationship between EU and Taiwan, and also on China's approach on Taiwan?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to meet these excellent and esteemed colleagues, especially talking about such an important topic. So, well, growing up in Central and Eastern Europe makes you highly cynical or pragmatic, if you like. And therefore, let me approach your question from this very cynical perspective. The EU-China trade agreement is a trade agreement. So the European Union was about to pursue its trade interest vis-a-vis China. And I don't really think that it may have any impact on EU-Taiwan relations on value-based issues connecting the EU and China. So when it really comes to, I think, to the understanding of EU-China relations, Taiwan is a great example, because we all know that most of the Taiwanese decision makers and probably most of the Taiwanese people are convinced that the status quo between China and between the mainland and the island is in their best interest. The status quo has been serving their interests pretty well in the past few decades. And even though we know that some younger people have some different thoughts on that, still, when it comes to EU-China relations, we have to face the fact that the status quo between the EU and China is very convenient to the European Union and has been very convenient to the European Union. The EU wants to make money, and of course, now I'm using the term the EU, but of course we should talk about economic interest groups within the EU, and particularly in Germany. So when it comes to the future of EU-China relations, I think the key is post-Merkel Germany. And I've read a lot of articles, making some guesses, some educated guesses about how Germany may behave in the post-Merkel era. But nobody really knows that. And even though some of the potential successors of Angela Merkel seems to be more, critical towards China, we also know that being critical towards China in opposition or, in the shadow of power, it's something very, very convenient and easy. But when these people, whoever will replace Angela Merkel, when he or she comes to power, will have to face the fact that the German interest groups are still mostly pro-China and they want to make business with China, even though there are some concerns as well in Germany. So another important issue is, of course, the US impact or the factor of the United States of America. On the one hand, I think it's good news to see that China failed in separating the EU from the United States, even under the Trump administration, even though the Trump administration did whatever it was able to do to make the Europeans angry about the US, but still China did not succeed in separating these two transatlantic partners. And now it will be very interesting to see how the Biden administration walks the talk, whether it really intends building an alliance, a global alliance of like-minded democracies, and then the EU, of course, must react to that. And Central European countries, particularly Hungary, will have to react to that in some way, but this is a topic I'd like to leave to Ivana. And finally, the vaccine diplomacy, I think that's something we also have to talk about a little bit. Many people argue that the vaccine diplomacy really serves China's interest in the European Union, and it can, make European countries a friend of China again. I don't really believe in that. I think the vaccine diplomacy may ease relations, tensions in the relations only temporarily, but when we are done with this whole pandemic, I can easily imagine that China blaming, China bashing could return to the domestic discourse in EU countries, because once again, for cynical reasons, I'm saying that, because a lot of European politicians will have to face very critical questions. How the hell did Europe screw up this whole pandemic situation that much? And then in that case, it would be very easy to blame China, that it is not because of us, it is because of China mishandled the pandemic at the very beginning in 2020. Even though I don't think that it is correct to blame China for whatever mistakes the European Union and its member states have done in the past few months. And of course, a final say or a final sentence, handing over the word to Ivana. The 17+1 is falling apart as we speak. And I think that we will also have a major impact on EU-China relations if it eventually falls apart. What we see right now, it's not really promising about the future, but I guess Ivana will have a lot to say about that.
Okay, thank you very much, Tamás. Yeah, we could hear a more, let's say, a realist approach from you than from Andrew, but yeah, I think it's really important question how much the EU will leave or would like to leave with its possible leverage on China when it comes to trade, connecting trade to anything value related. I think based on the track record so far, probably I think you're right, Tamás, that it will not be at the, let's say, forefront of the approach and negotiations. So over to you, Ivana. First of all, what do you think about what Tamás has just said, that the 17+1 is just falling apart? We can see really divergent approaches in Central Eastern Europe when it comes to China, and including the point that Tamás has just raised. I mean, there is some China bashing in some countries in Central Eastern Europe. In some others, such as Hungary, we do not hear that much, to say the very least. And so this is one question. How should we look at let's say broader Central Eastern Europe and the Road and Belt Initiative? How successful China was so far to create any kind of more or less similar approach in the target countries towards China. One question. The other one, I think of course, it's inseparable from the question of the relationship with China, but we do not hear so much about the relationship with Taiwan from these countries. So, and of course, I think we really rarely hear proud voices that talk about Taiwan and independence and issues like that. But how do you see these two interlinked issues? Sorry, I know it's a bit too much for a question, but I know you're a good speaker, so you will be able to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for having so much faith in me, actually, and thank you, Political Capital, for inviting me. It's great to be with you, and good morning, everyone who is listening. Well, you asked so many questions, and we can actually very easily spend a number of hours on that, but I will try to be brief and to fulfill your expectations you have placed in me. So as for the 17+1, I wouldn't say it's actually falling apart. I would argue it's changing. And I would even go further, and I would argue it's not changing for good. It's not changing for being a better platform, actually. Because with Lithuania leaving, very likely Estonia leaving, and then Latvia leaving as well, because they follow and they don't want to break the ranks of the Baltic countries, what will probably happen will be that Beijing will apply much more pressure to the rest of the countries which stayed. And also those who stayed would, some of them, and here I'm looking at you, Tamas, and also to my home country, will probably be even eager to show that they still support the platforms. So we may see a lot of even weirder and more bizarre gestures than we have seen from Mr. Orban and Mr. Zeman so far. So I wouldn't necessarily argue that three countries which were very assertive and which were very, I would say, difficult to bend over to Beijing's will. So the fact that they are leaving would be necessarily better for the platform. Having them inside may be actually much more beneficial, because we as 17 Central Eastern European countries, or at least those who are willing to do that and who are thinking in these strategic intentions, would be much more capable of applying pressure to China than with the trio leaving. As for the other questions you asked me, well, I think I will probably tackle it from a different perspective or a different angle and link it to what Tamas already said and Andrew also mentioned, and also to Taiwan, because that's the focus of today's webinar, right? And also I think it's going to be much more fun if we try to incorporate the Taiwan's perspective. So let's talk a little bit about how Taiwan can actually use the current situation and how it can use the Central and Eastern European countries in that, at least the members of the EU who are in Central and Eastern Europe. So I would start with arguing that Taiwan is mostly a part of the US game, not necessarily a part of the EU game. So there are definitely ways of improvement that. And logically, if I were Taiwan, I would probably start with Central and Eastern Europe, because these countries are actually facing economic security dilemma. On one hand, we are part of the German supply chains. So we are some kind of extension of German economy. So we tend to bind with Berlin wishes and Berlin approach. And so far, Berlin approach is highly accommodating towards China in general. Of course, there are different voices, but let's talk in general. And also, while Berlin is part of or providing economic benefits, put it this way, it's not willing to provide security guarantees. So far we are still looking at the US to be a security guarantor, to provide security for Central and Eastern Europeans. So we are caught in between the wishes and signaling of Washington and the wishes of signaling of Berlin in that respect. But on the other hand, and here comes China actually, we are also less vulnerable economically, because there is still a lack of FDI coming from China to Central and Eastern Europe. According to Merrick's last reports, it was about 2% of the overall FDI which went to European Union, basically landed in Central and Eastern Europe. And we also know from last year's example, when the Czech president of the Senate, Researh, visited Taiwan, that despite China rattling sabers and despite its rhetorics, in economic terms, we didn't suffer anything. So, well, there is definitely a an opportunity for Central and Eastern European countries to be much more bold towards China, because there is not going to be significant economic retaliation. And also Taiwan is by far a bigger investor than China is in whole Central and Eastern Europe. So in Czech Republic, it's following the investment from Japan and South Korea, then is Taiwan, and then somehow far, far away is actually Chinese investment. So despite the rhetorics, I would really like to focus on the facts, on the numbers here, and base the foreign policy on those facts and numbers. And it would be very smart policy for Taiwan to actually continue working on this with Central and Eastern European countries, also because a number of them, as post-communist countries, have the legacy of value-based foreign policy. So at least some of the political parties still value that, some of the political parties still return to that, as seen in Lithuania, as seen in Slovakia, and it's most likely going to be seen after the elections in Czech Republic in October 2021. So, and the next part of advice, if I'm in a position to give advice to anyone, would be to basically emulate the case of Czechia last year. So to focus on independent players, to focus on autonomous players. If you do recall, 2 years ago, already two years ago, Prague severed the ties with Beijing. It severed the ties, the municipality agreement between Prague and Beijing. Almost no retaliation followed. And China was quite furious and started to apply pressure. But on the other hand, the whole explanation from the Czech side was that municipalities are autonomous. You can't force them to do anything. Of course, it's not their place to do foreign policy. But on the other hand, if they do, you can't force them, you can't stop them. And the same goes for the Czech president of the Senate. In reality, he shouldn't have any foreign policy powers, but in practice, he's quite independent to do whatever he pleases to do. So this policy could be actually emulated. Of course, all of this is based on a prerequisite that China will continue to make mistakes, as it did in the past couple of years in Central and Eastern Europe, where it promised a lot of deliverables, but the words didn't materialize into deeds. So little investment, almost no jobs created here. So nothing really what would be of value to Central and Eastern Europeans. So if China continues making those mistakes, I think there is a huge potential for Taiwan to actually cooperate with Central and Eastern European countries, and through them actually, to a certain extent, also influence the policy of the whole European Union. On the other hand, if China makes it right, then we are in a bigger problem. And if the EU continues to make mistakes as well, as it did after the global financial crisis, when it opened actually the doors for Chinese investment and for Chinese influence, then we are in a trouble as well, because what we have seen after the global financial crisis was lack of solidarity coming from the Western European countries. And if this is going to happen again after COVID-19 crisis, then once again, we may be falling into the trap, because China will once again promise something. And if it makes it right, if it learns the lessons, then I'm afraid that Central and Eastern European countries will tend to fall for the trap once again. And I would like to stop here and take whatever you may have as questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ivana, and also thank you for raising the issue of the volume of investments, because I think it's extremely important, and this kind of I think it's a symptom of this authoritarian inflation, that while everyone talks about investments coming from China in Central Eastern Europe, in fact, the investments from Taiwan simply, I mean, in terms of volume, in most of the countries in CE is more important. So I think it's, and this is not necessarily, I think, a fact that is very well known in the policy community of these countries. So thanks for raising that. And to your point on the value-based foreign policy, Central Eastern Europe, I think it's a crucially important one as well. And an interesting fact, it doesn't have too much connection to each other, but in most Central Eastern European countries, the first democratic free parliamentary elections were held in 1990, in Taiwan in 1992. So even in terms of timing, there are some possibilities for good historical remembrance to the democratic development. Yeah, thank you. I mean, Yuyan, I would like to turn to you now, and first of all, I'm curious what you think about what Ivana raised about the possibilities of let's say Central Eastern European countries in establishing better relationship with Taiwan. One thing, the other thing, I would be curious about the discussions going on in Taiwan about the expectations from the West, expectations from the United States, expectations from the European Union. I won't go that far to say expectations from Central Eastern Europe because I don't think it's too much in the forefront of the discussions in Taiwan. But I would like to hear this angle that what is the perception of the China policy and the Taiwan policy of the United States, the EU and the West in more general?
Okay, thank you for so many questions again, and I fully agree with what Ivana just raised, especially when she mentioning about China making if China keeps making mistakes, will open the door or allowing Taiwan more opportunities to engage Central and Eastern Europe. And for your question regarding Taiwan's expectation, I think the most important thing is the nature of the interaction between Taiwan and Eastern Europe, and comparing to China's approach to Eastern Europe. Basically, Taiwan is seeking for a more reciprocal relations with European countries. But on the other hand, Chinese approach is a whole different story, as all of you know. And second of all, I believe that more opportunities for Taiwan and Eastern Europe to expose to each other, to open more opportunities, is also a very important aspect. And third one is, as Ivana just and all other colleagues mentioned, this common value, like-minded approach is also very important for Taiwan to engage Eastern Europe. And number four is this good governance. I will take the platform Taiwanese government has been promoting for years, is GCTF, Global Cooperation and Training Framework. I don't know if our colleagues heard of that platform or not. Right now is that platform was specifically designed for good governance. So we have lots of various cooperations with the states. For example, for the protection of high-tech, pandemic as well, and also female rights. A lot of cooperations with the states, and also Japan jumping last year as well. So good governance is, I think, is one of the important approach for Eastern Europe and Taiwan. And the next will be the high degree of high-tech R&D activities. I think Ivana just Thomas also mentioned the importance of semiconductor and high-tech industries. So I think high-tech industry R&D activities is one of the very important interface for Taiwan to connect with Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. I would like to turn to Andrew now and raise raise a question about, I don't want to over-personalize the relationship and generally the foreign policy, but Andrew, what do you think we can project? I mean, what can we tell about in the U.S. administration about the decision makers who will mainly drive the China policy, and what are the let's say, if you can tell a bit about the most important players, their background and how they fit into the picture that you highlighted so far. And one other small question, how serious you think is the resentment in the United States about the European Union because of this ongoing negotiations with the trade agreement? I mean, it was raised on the bilateral talks as well between the United States and the EU that there would be need for a more coordinated approach. So how serious you think this conflict is? How easy it is to manage?
Thanks. So let me try and do the first question without going through and naming all of the individuals and their views and doing it that way, but just as a sort of overview of the kinds of people who have been appointed and what this kind of signifies. The helpful thing actually is if you go through every single White House appointee, almost everyone has written very extensively on the China question. You can go down the foreign affairs pieces from a list of the individuals right down to kind of director level for China in the White House and look at the framework of thinking that's there. And it's kind of unusually open in that sense in terms of the kind of conceptual architecture that you have, whether you're at the Jake Sullivan level or you're at the, well, I won't go down to the names of all the China director level, but the common threads I think are there is an abiding sense that the competition piece is at the center of the relationship. You do not have many of the kind of old bilateral relationship managers in these roles. It's generally, whether you're looking in the State Department, whether you're looking at appointments in USTR, whether you're looking at all the people in the White House, whether you're looking at DOD, all of these people are people who, some of them are actually a slightly younger generation who've kind of related to China in a very different way to the kind of old guard of the China hands. They're people who've kind of grown up with a sense of that competition is the kind of central element in the relationship between the two sides, and there are very few of the kind of classic China hands, even among the younger generation there as well. So I'd say the competition piece is to the fore, but also the understanding of what the competition amounts to is a wider one than the kind of classic military competition. This is where I think you see the kind of common strands across from the previous administration. If you look at the writing and the work from the people who are coming into these things, a lot of them have looked not just at the kind of external foreign policy security dimensions of competition with China. A lot of it's also focused on the economic and technology dimensions, a huge amount on the kind of domestic piece of things. If you look at the kind of White House architecture on this, and even Jake Sullivan himself, you have people who think about China policy not just in a bilateral context, not just in even a kind of multilateral or plurilateral context. You have people who think about it really in the context of wider grand strategy. Like, what are the domestic components of this? How do you use the China question to drive a whole series of other elements of US policy as well? So the industrial policy piece, domestic technology base, all of these sorts of questions as well. You're not having in some of these roles just people, the environment, green transition and competition in that sphere as well. You don't have people who just think about this in kind of narrow boxes. And I think almost across the board, I'd also note that a lot of the people who are in these jobs are more often the kind of partners and allies people than the bilateral piece as well. And I think if you look at someone like Kurt Campbell, one of the people who's had more focus in his previous job in this kind of question of networking European and Asian allies. You look at, well, actually, I'm not going to go through and name all of the people, but it's quite a strong characteristic that when you look at the declared elements of how the administration is going to shift policy and you look at the personnel that have been put in place to do it, there is high degrees of sync on this. And I think just very critically minded people on China. There's no question about that as well. I don't see at the personnel level much scope for a kind of big recalibration away from what we've seen so far in terms of the kind of underlying view that there needed to be a big reorientation in China policy. There needed to be a fundamental rethink. I don't think you have kind of restorationists, and there are restorationists in the Democratic Party. Most of them are not occupying these jobs. On your second question, I think it's posed questions about the European approach, partly because it plays into all of the traditional perceptions of the Europeans as kind of, their bottom line on China is commercial and these sorts of things. If you wound back to the arms embargo back in the mid-2000s, that kind of perception that when it comes down to it, the Europeans don't, because they're not as exposed on security terms, they're going to default to certain kinds of commercial interests with China. That can have a significantly negative effect on the sense of kind of the centrality of Europe to the kind of cooperation agenda when it comes to China. And I think this did play into that to an extent. Having said that, I think people are kind of ready to get over it. I don't think people have made too much of a thing of it in the bilateral exchanges that have been so far. There's less trust. There are question marks that have maybe been introduced a little bit by this, but I think people also don't want to get too hung up on this. The agreement itself is not a big deal or a big problem in terms of the scope for transatlantic cooperation on these things. It was the political signaling around it that was the issue. And going back to Tamash's point on this, I mean, there is now a question on the kind of post-Merkel space. We know that a lot of this was driven politically by Angela Merkel. People in the administration know that this was driven heavily by kind of not just German industry. I think it's really important to disaggregate this. This is a narrow subset of German industry. Parts of German industry have been at the center of actually pushing the more competitive dimensions of European policy too. The parts of German industry that understand that including, I mean, as we know, the BDI paper, the German Federation of Industries paper, was the one that came up with the concept of kind of systemic competition, because it's one thing when you're competing at the lower levels of the value chain. When it gets to advanced industries, there are parts of German industry in particular that are seriously concerned and threatened by this, and all of the developments that are accelerating on China at the moment on dual circulation and other things. If you're looking at this from a realist make money perspective, the concern is you will make your money for a small number of years and then it's game over for a number of major industries. And there's a huge amount of anxiety from certain pockets on German industry as well. And so I think there is an understanding on the US side as well that in the same way that they've gone through this deep realignment of thinking that says, is market access fundamentally, is deepening economic ties with China really the priority? Have we got there in that rethink on the European side yet to say that needs to be revisited? Not necessarily yet, but I think that the sense is that that there has been an understanding that a transition is underway on European policy. The CAI was a bit of a kind of temporary setback, but I think we've got quite a bit further to go. And I wouldn't necessarily expect that German industry is intrinsically, beyond the obvious candidates in the automotive sector, chemicals, and one or two other pieces, are necessarily going to be a drag always on making progress in that regard. Some of them are actually going to be driving this potentially as well.
Okay, thank you for raising that. Also, I do think that in the last few years we could see a gradual development to a more cautious and conscious approach by EU institution towards China, and I do think it goes beyond rhetoric. Also, we can have some hope in the European Parliament that seems to be the conscience of the European Union, and also it seems to be more more hardliner when it comes to China-related issues, and also human rights abuses of China, and also the interlinkages between trade and values. Okay, we have some wonderful questions from some of the attendees, so let me throw them to the panel. First question. What is the amount of Taiwanese investments in Central Eastern European countries? This question would go to you, Tamás. You have written extensively about such issues, so please clarify this issue of Taiwanese investments in CE countries. in contrast with Chinese?
I wish I could clarify. Actually, you know, in the past decade, everyone was writing pieces extensively on the level of Chinese investment in Central and Eastern Europe. But meanwhile, we do not know too much about Taiwanese investment. As many of you certainly knows, it is really hard to track investment because of the current global statistical standards are just simply not up to the task. And we have problems with tracking investment coming across third parties, third countries and tax havens. But generally speaking, the Taiwanese investment in Hungary is around 250 to 300 million euros. So significantly lower than the Chinese investment. And that is natural, of course, because the Chinese economy is so much bigger than the Taiwanese. So I only found data what expresses it as a percentage, and it seems that Taiwanese investment is around 1 or maximum 2% of all investment in the Central and Eastern European countries. So it's very, very low, but not insignificant. Okay, so we have a few hundred millions of euros of Chinese investment in most of the bigger Central European countries, but the Chinese investment is much bigger, that, of course.
Okay, thank you. Agnes Sunomar and her colleagues wrote a piece that you recommended to me, in fact, and I think in some countries in Central Eastern Europe, this is, I mean, Taiwanese investments are having a bigger volume than Chinese one, but as you said, I mean, there is a lack of clear, how to say, optics, so probably a good and important task for policy makers and also for think tanks to create a good data first to have a clear vision on this issue. Okay, thank you. Next question from Irena Götzova on the 17+1 development. What do you expect to change in the EU and EU's powers approach towards 14+1? So I think this is a question that fits perfectly to Ivana's expertise. So what do you think about that? And please clarify, what does 14+1 means compared to 17+1?
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Irena or Ms. Götzova. One thing about or clarification regarding the Taiwanese investment, as Tamás said, it's quite difficult to track the numbers because they tend to really be very, very different from different statistics, not only Chinese statistics, but also our national statistics. But what we can actually focus on, if that's some kind of value, also is the number of jobs which were created and which are, of course, significant for the local administrations. And that's in comparison, Taiwan created 24,000 new jobs in Czech Republic in comparison to 4,000 created by China. But once again, I would be dubious regarding the actual numbers. Just please look at the trends or look at the discrepancy between those numbers, but not necessarily take me by words regarding 24 versus 4. As for the question on 14+1, well, let's do some mathematics. It's not only 3 Baltic states which are leaving, it's also 3 EU member states who are leaving. So now we have 9 EU member states minus Hungary, so 8 versus 5 Western Balkans non-EU members, which, as I said, is going to apply much more pressure to create some kind of consensus or even think whether the consensus is worth building under these circumstances. For the EU, I think it's wish granted to a certain extent because the EU has been criticizing the format for a number of years, while the US was actually encouraging quietly the Central Eastern European countries to keep the format, saying that it's annoying to German diplomats, so keep it. But that's just the anecdotal evidence. So for EU, I don't think there is going to be any negative reaction, on the contrary on that. But let's look also at the Central and Eastern European countries. I'm not sure it's necessarily a win for them because it's going to receive less, or they are going to receive less attention from the Brussels. And one of the arguments made for some kind of cooperation or coordination within 17 countries, not necessarily with China, but within 17, was actually to make them a bigger space in the China table, which is discussed, or in the China diplomacy, which is discussed in Brussels. And there is a lot of backlash, and has been historically a lot of backlash and a lot of uneasiness by Central and Eastern Europeans on how the China policy is driven sometimes. And it was quite visible with the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which was necessarily a German run or German finished endeavor, where the Central and Eastern European countries felt they were really omitted. But it doesn't apply only to CEE countries, it applies almost to everyone. Italy also was not quite okay with having to give Germany a blanco check, actually having to decide on CAI without actually seeing the agreement. The same goes for Netherlands, which was not okay with the energy sector, Spain, the Baltic trio, and so on. So there was a lot of say bad blood regarding this agreement, and Central and Eastern Europeans have been pointing to this issue, that they don't have a place in the table where the China policy is discussed. It's usually Franco-German endeavor. So it's not really giving them that much power in terms not only towards Beijing, but also towards Brussels. As for, yeah, I think I may stop here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so we have quite a lot of still good questions in the line, and I'm happy to say that the head of Taiwan's representative office to Hungary have raised a question as well. So let me throw it into the panel, and then it will give us some good forethought for the final round. This is Liu Shichung, Taiwan's representative to Hungary. Thank you for the insightful and inspiring presentation and comments. I have a question about the Biden's administration's next move to EU, as well as how Taiwan can fit in the future US-EU re-engagement. President Biden made a clear point at the Munich Security Conference a couple of days ago that he wants to revitalize of law-abiding democracies against the global rise of authoritarian political forces. All participants have touched upon areas where Taiwan can play strategic roles, such as democracy promotion, supply chain and technological cooperation, fight against disinformation, exchange of experiences in post-pandemic era, and so on. So what exactly are the approaches that all participants recommend Taiwan to do? Should Taiwan approach to individual EU countries or as a group to address those issues? To what extent can Taiwan team up with the US and reach out to like-minded European partners to deepen ties in those areas, particularly the CEC countries? So thank you, dear Ambassador, for I think these are really important questions. I don't think we can respond all of them in details, but let me first turn to Andrew for a very short comment on one aspect of all that, the Biden's administration's next move to EU and how Taiwan can fit in the future US-EU re-engagement. And what Taiwan should do, by the way.
And I'd be very interested to hear from Ivana and Tomasz on the kind of some of the tactical questions that he raises at the end. I mean, I think we're still in very much consultation phase. The Biden administration is just going to move around with a set of consultations on partners and allies in this early stage to kind of figure out the parameters of the possible. So I think we're going to kind of have to get past this very early set of consultations before we fully understand what the parameters of the transatlantic cooperation piece are going to amount to in particular, but the wider democratic coalition. There's going to be a whole series of overlapping coalitions that the US is trying to build in this regard that are often going to be kind of issue-based. And so it will be a matter of kind of picking out the issue area of where it's possible to cooperate with kind of these new groupings that are emerging. And I don't think it's going to be a monolithic D10 or G7 centered or any of these sorts of things. These are going to be highly issue specific. So technology cooperation or export controls or supply chains or democracy support in international organizations. There's going to be a whole, so it's really picking an issue list and seeing where it's possible to slot in. And I think Europe's going to be at the center of a number of these, and specific European countries are going to be at the center of a number of these. And the EU itself is going to be at the center of a number of these, just necessarily given the role and economic weight and weight that it has in decision-making on standard setting, industrial policy, regulation, trade, a whole series of these things where the EU is going to play an important role. So I think of the issues that he's raised, I think all of them are areas where it's possible, as I suggested in my introduction, to think about this in the context of kind of democratic coalition work. And I will be very interested to hear whether it's tactically efficacious to do this with the US in a European context, where there are some countries where that's certainly true, and there's some countries where that would be exactly the opposite of the best approach. There are still sensitivities at the moment, transatlantically on parts on the European side, on not being seen as just a kind of junior partner to the US and things like this. So I think some of the approach that's also taken that is just EU and national level specific will work better with certain countries, and it shouldn't just be seen through a US prism. But as these kind of coalitions and groupings emerge on some of these issues, there's clearly going to be areas in which, once the parameters of that have been worked out, particularly in areas such as technology and the wider economic framework and some of these pieces, but a longer list as well, where it would be very, very much possible for Taiwan to be a part of that. And it should, and I do genuinely think that there's a stronger understanding now in parts on the European side that Taiwan is necessarily a part of some of these groupings as well, however that's structured. And some of these will not be highly visible, I would add as well. Some of these will be quite discreet and quiet and will be able to be worked out in formats that mean that some of the political sensitivities around this are not going to kind of curtail the capacity to push ahead on the substance of cooperation on these areas.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andrew. And Yuyan, what would be your point to the ambassador's question? What should Taiwan do? So in 1 minute, so very briefly.
Oh, okay. Thank you. For the ambassador's question, I think I just mentioned earlier about the high-tech industry cooperation between Eastern Europe and Taiwan. And in fact, including lots of Taiwanese, high-tech companies, including Acer, Asus, and also Honghai also invest in Eastern Europe. Especially Honghai just set up a new factory in Eastern Europe in year 2020, last year. And that's one. And secondly is the financial industry as well. As you all know, financial industry is a very special industry because it's relating to the government's good governance capabilities as well. So that aspect is the kind of credential or capabilities not Chinese government can provide because we focus on things like transparency, auditing capabilities of your financial industry. So I believe financial industry is also one of the important interface for Taiwan and Eastern Europe as well. And number three is petroleum chemistry industry. Taiwan is, although it's a small country and island country, but Taiwan is very strong at petrochemistry industry as well. So that's one possibility. And number four is telecommunication industry as well. And and lastly, because I'm a security scholar, I mainly study security issues. And I think Eastern Europe experience, especially in missile defense, is also one of the very important opportunity for Taiwan to cooperate. As we all know, the US government deployed the entire missile defense, IAMD, integrated air and missile defense system in Europe, setting up the headquarters in Turkey, the Aegis fleet in Spain, and Aegis Ashore in Poland and in Romania. So Eastern Europe's experience for decades in terms of missile defense is also very important for Taiwan to learn. So I think those are the important topic and interface for Taiwan to cooperate with Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Quite an ambitious agenda, I have to say. Thank you for raising all those. So Ivana, you have already mentioned a few issues such as the value-based foreign policy, but what are the most important things, very briefly, where you see Taiwan's possibilities in reaching out more, especially to EU partners?
Thank you, Peter. I will try to be brief. First of all, I think that Dr. Kuo's suggestions are really very concrete and very good ones, and that's definitely areas for cooperations, which cooperation where Central and Eastern Europeans would be interested. I will probably tackle it from a broader perspective, and that's, well, despite all the development, despite all the rhetorics, I don't think that Central and Eastern Europeans are ready to ditch one China policy. That would be a big issue, and that would go far beyond what they are probably ready to do so far. So that would be probably unrealistic to think in these terms. But what we can do, and what we already have seen Central and Eastern Europeans doing, is to disrupt one China policy on the fringes. That's, you know, lobbying for more space for Taiwan in international organizations and international fora, opening the economic representative offices in Taipei, increased visits of political actors, which are mostly symbolic, but on the other hand, the symbols actually talks, and politics is very much about symbols. So I would still continue, if I were Taiwan, I would still continue in that, encouraging that. And as for some tactical issues, well, the best thing is to start with the governments who are already inclined to do that, to work more with Taiwan, and that's Lithuania, that's Slovakia and Estonia as well. So that would be my first targets actually to look at more closely. And then in other countries where the governments are not willing to go extra mile, or where they're still in a thinking of that that they don't want to have China retaliate against their economies, then I would probably focus on, once again, on autonomous players, be it municipalities, be it different political players, which are not entitled to do foreign policy, but in practice they do that. On cooperation with NGOs, think tanks, cooperation with academia, and all these practical issues which were mentioned by Dr. Kuo. That would probably be my very short response to that.
Thank you, Ivana. And last but absolutely not least, Tamás, what would be your recommendation for Taiwanese diplomats?
Well, I'm not in a position to give any advice to Taiwanese, diplomats, especially.
But it was just asked. So
yeah, right. So I think there is definitely a window of opportunity to Taiwan today in Central and Eastern Europe, especially when it comes to soft power. China has been doing a lot to increase its soft power in the region. I don't think it's very successful. And what is even more important, that China has always followed and will always follow a top-bottom approach. If I may recommend something to Taiwan, that a bottom-up approach would be much better. Go to the people, approach the people, and first of all, try to find connections to the youth. Most of our students are not even aware that all the Asus computers, all the Acer computers, all of those gadgets they use every day are from Taiwan. Taiwan could be easily turned into a sexy topic for young people because it has so many things to give, and it can give all of these messages in a much more organic way than the Chinese. One of the major problems of Chinese soft power diplomacy, that it is controlled by the state. What makes it kind of hard to believe at the very first place. And China is a democracy, so it can approach people through a bottom-up approach. Another very particular advice, if I may say so, Taiwanese producers are one of the best in the era of gaming computers. So Taiwan could easily, I don't know, maybe they have done so before, but I've never seen it in Central Europe. They could easily organize some kind of gaming competition, you know, for young people, branding Taiwan in that way. And at last but not least, half of the world, including Central Europe, is sitting in home office and homeschool. I could think about Taiwanese companies, technological companies, IT companies, finding out some kind of maybe even symbolic way to help people staying home, working home, studying from home, just simply to share the brand of Taiwan to Central and Eastern European average people, not, you know, the politicians, but average people. So that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for all for raising these very important points. I think it was very fair combination of general but quite specific recommendations as well. And so thank you, Ivana, Andrew, Tamás, and Yulian for being here. Thank you for National Policy Research for co-organizing this event with Political Capital Institute. Thank you for the ambassador for the questions, and also for the participants, for the ones who raised questions, and for everyone who was curious to see this debate. I might be a bit biased, but I think it's really a lot of food for thought, and I think we've managed to fly over all these topics and to give a very good bird perspective on the issues of Taiwanese, Chinese, Taiwanese Western and Chinese Western relationships. So thank you all, and thanks for coming, and see you next time at next event. So goodbye and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you. Take care.